Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Lou Leary, and I'm the Deputy Director for State, Local, and Tribal Affairs at the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the first in a series of webinars on synthetic cannabinoids, things like spice and other new synthetic drugs. Next slide, please. New synthetic drugs are chemical compounds that are designed or manufactured, oftentimes using chemicals that are not controlled under the Controlled Substances Act, to have the same effects as controlled substances like marijuana, cocaine, and heroin. New synthetic drugs have no licit purposes. They're sold online and in stores. They're marketed to mask their intended purpose, with statements on the packaging like not for human consumption or for novelty use only. Suppliers aggressively market these substances to young people using logos and patterns drawn from popular culture, like Scooby-Doo, used to market Scooby Snacks, which is a dangerous synthetic cannabinoid. Suppliers also describe them as safe or legal or as traditional illicit drugs. Next slide, please. Worldwide, the market for new synthetic drugs is one of the most rapidly evolving. By 2013, 348 new synthetic drugs, sometimes referred to as new psychoactive substances, had been reported to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. The majority were identified between 2008 and 2013. Next slide, please. We know very little about the prevalence of use of these drugs in the general population. The study called Monitoring the Future, a survey of 8th, 10th, and 12th grade students, added questions on past year use of synthetic cannabis among seniors in 2011 and among 8th and 10th graders in 2012. In 2014, nearly 6% of seniors reported having used synthetic cannabis in the past year. 5.4% of 10th graders used it in the past year, and 3.3% of 8th graders did so. The Monitoring the Future survey added questions about past year use of synthetic cathinone, that's like bath salts, among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in 2012. Use rates in 2014 did not exceed 1% for any of the three grades. To try to get a better understanding of use trends, ONDCP funded a pilot study in 2013. Urine samples from over 1,000 subjects from criminal justice populations that had been previously tested were retested for more than 30 illicit drugs, controlled medications, and 12 synthetic cannabinoids. Results from that study indicated that synthetic cannabinoids were just as likely to be found in persons who had initially tested positive for marijuana, cocaine, heroin, meth, or PCP, as in persons who had initially not tested positive for these drugs. But regardless of how use rates for new synthetic drugs compare with some traditional illicit drugs, the risks to health can be significant, including serious injury and even death. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will be an introduction to these dangerous drugs. It will cover health-related risks, manufacture and distribution, and federal enforcement and regulatory provisions. Our speakers are Dr. Michael Bauman from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Scott Albrecht from the Drug Enforcement Administration, and Debbie and Keith Bjork, parent activists who are working to protect young people from these dangerous drugs. After hearing all the presentations, we will open the lines for questions. Let's get started. Dr. Bauman has been with the National Institute on Drug Abuse since 1991. In 2012, he and his colleagues established the Designer Drug Research Unit, or the DDRU, to collect, analyze, and provide information about the pharmacology and toxicology of synthetic drugs. The DDRU works closely with DEA and the National Drug Early Warning System, and it's at the forefront of research to address the global epidemic of new synthetic drug use. Dr. Bauman?
Thank you, Deputy Director. The title of my talk is Designer Drugs of Abuse, Playing Russian Roulette with Brain Function. Next slide, please. Designer drugs, or new psychoactive substances, as already mentioned, are alternatives to classic drugs of abuse. These drugs are synthetic drugs of abuse made by clandestine chemists. They're sold under false pretenses as harmless household products. They're easy to obtain from the internet, smoke shops, gas stations, etc. And they can often be used without detection since urine toxicology screens do not recognize these drugs. Next slide, please. Just to give some sense of the extent of this problem, has already been mentioned, the appearance of these substances is increasing at an alarming rate on a global scale. In 2009, the European Monitoring Center of Drugs and Drug Addiction Early Warning System identified 24 new synthetic drugs. In 2010, it identified 41 more. In 2011, another 49. In 2012, there were 73 more. By October 2013, a further 56 new compounds had already been identified for a total of 243 new synthetic drugs in just 4 years. Next slide. The Internet has fostered the widespread availability and misuse of these substances. Because free information is available on the Internet and can be shared by all. The type of information that is utilized, for example, medical research has identified the mechanism of action for classic drugs of abuse like cocaine, marijuana, heroin. And then the medical literature also provides recipes for making novel psychoactive drugs that target these mechanisms. Marketing and sales of these substances on websites allows for anonymous purchases. And finally, trip reports about the drug use experiences are shared on internet forums such as Erowid and Blue Light. Now, there are an overwhelming number of new synthetic drugs, as has been mentioned previously. One way to classify these drugs is based on the drugs that they intend to mimic. For example, we can break the drugs down into categories like cannabinoid synthetics, such as spice, which induce marijuana-like effects, stimulant synthetics, such as bath salts, which induce cocaine-like effects, hallucinogens, such as N-bombs, which induce LSD-like effects, and opioids that induce morphine-like effects. Next slide. The cannabinoid psychoactive substances are often referred to colloquially as spice or K2. On the left side, you see an example of a product. Now, it's noteworthy that these particular substances are usually sprayed onto plant materials. On the right side of the slide, you see chemical structures of THC, which is the active ingredient of marijuana, and JWH, which is one of the popular synthetics. And the thing to note is that the chemical structure of the synthetic is unique. It's quite different from THC. Next slide. Cannabinoid NPS are typically used by inhalation of smoke using pipes, joints, and more via e-cigarettes and vaping. These drugs work by activating CB1 or cannabinoid 1 receptors in the brain. And these receptors decrease cell function in memory regions like the hippocampus. Psychoactive effects of these drugs include perceptual distortions similar to the effects of marijuana, but it's important to note that the synthetics are much more potent than THC. That is, the same amount of drug causes much stronger effects when you're talking about the synthetics. Adverse effects include increased heart rate, vomiting, acute kidney injury, hallucinations, panic attacks, and persistent psychosis. Next slide, please. What about the stimulant psychoactive substances? These are colloquially termed bath salts, or RCs, or research chemicals. On the left side of the slide, you see an example of bath salts, and you see that they're white powders laid out in lines that are snorted. On the right side, you see the structure of cocaine as compared to MDPV. MDPV was a popular bath salt constituent, and again, you'll notice that the chemical structures of these two drugs, that is cocaine versus MDPV, are quite distinct. So again, the synthetic drug is structurally different than the classic drug of abuse. Next slide. Stimulant psychoactive substances can be used by oral ingestion, snorting, or intravenous injection. The stimulants act on dopamine transporters in the brain. All of these drugs increase dopamine in reward or pleasure centers of the brain. The psychoactive effects of the stimulant MPS include euphoria, increased energy. As what we saw with the synthetic cannabinoids, the synthetic stimulants like MDPV are much more potent than cocaine. Thus, they're apt to cause adverse consequences such as increased heart rate and blood pressure, hyperthermia or increased body temperature, agitation, delirium, psychosis, and death. Next slide, please. Here we see the hallucinogenic psychoactive substances, often called N-bombs or smiles. In the left side, you see examples of the products. In the lower example, you see tiny squares, and these are often placed on the tongue as a way of administering these substances. On the right side of the slide, you see LSD, the structure of a classic hallucinogen, and below it you see the synthetic. Once again, the synthetic drugs are structurally distinct when compared to the classic drug of abuse. Next slide. The hallucinogens are usually used by oral ingestion, either on paper or small wafers. Occasionally, they also can be administered as a liquid. These drugs activate 5-HT2A receptors in the brain. These are serotonin receptors, and these receptors control brain function in areas of sensory perception like the cortex and the thalamus. The drugs cause perceptual distortions similar to the effects of LSD, and again, the synthetics are much more potent than the classic drug of abuse. Adverse consequences include increased heart rate and blood pressure, hyperthermia, agitation, delirium, and sometimes death. Next slide. So to summarize, use of these psychoactive substances, these new synthetic drugs, presents a number of dangerous health risks. The drugs can produce life-threatening adverse medical consequences. The biological effects of these drugs are not studied and are unknown. Users cannot be sure the precise chemical constituents of the products. And finally, these products can contain toxic impurities, byproducts, or adulterants that in themselves are quite dangerous. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Baumann. Next, we'll hear from Scott Albrecht, Supervisory Special Agent with the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. He joins us from Milwaukee, Wisconsin District Office. He's been in law enforcement for over 20 years and has been working on synthetic drug investigations for many of those years, including 3 years in The Hague, Netherlands, where he worked closely with Dutch investigators and Europol. Special Agent Albrecht.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon. And thank you for inviting DEA to participate in such an important topic. Hopefully the message I put forth today from the law enforcement side will help those on the line get a better feel, educate themselves, and be able to handle these type of drugs should they encounter them in all walks of life. Synthetic drugs have been the focus and niche of a somewhat savvy and out-of-the-box thinking trafficker for many years. We've seen drugs such as LSD, MDMA, GHB, and many other types of stimulants and hallucinogens hit the street and be marketed as alternatives and straight-up drugs of abuse for many years, creating designer drugs most times to circumvent laws that are on the books. yet keep a drug in production that is desired by an end user, a consumer. The cannabinoids, as we talked about already, spice, and as it goes by many other names, and somewhat the cathinones, bath salts, and the other new synthetics that have hit the street are trafficked by, again, a savvy trafficker that are somewhat different in this new age because they've been able to capitalize on the new synthetics when they first hit the shores of the U.S. in roughly 2007, 2008, been able to capitalize those drugs not fitting readily into an identifiable illegal lane, and then produce those drugs and keep going to try to circumvent laws in a somewhat legitimate and pseudo-legitimate retail market, as we sometimes see these sold in brick-and-mortar stores. The trafficker has been able to somewhat circumvent local, state, federal legislation, which is always trying to catch up, but is doing a good job at this point. From the onset, first fighting FDA regulations, for instance, and then criminal violations, the industry of these new synthetic drugs, the drug importers, the manufacturers, and distributors have relied on perpetuating a bit of an illusion of legality that the end user then sees and believes maybe the drugs they're using is legal. Next slide, please. But what are we dealing with? We've heard a lot of names. We've heard new synthetic drugs, new psychoactive substances, which is the term NPS, which is used in the international community, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. We say generically synthetic drugs due to these drugs, all of them coming from a non-organic source, such as marijuana being grown, cocaine coming from a coca plant. The synthetic drugs are made in covert laboratories and come from the synthetic side. But we like to refer to them, as we have for years, as designer drugs, as defined by Merriam-Webster, a synthetic version of a controlled substance, such as a synthetic version of heroin, that is produced with a slightly altered molecular structure to avoid the drug itself being classified as a drug. Next slide, please. But where did they come from? We've been dealing with them for years. The old synthetic drugs, somewhat different than the new. Some people may remember back into the 60s and 70s, Dr. Timothy Leary, and on the left and on the right into the 70s and 80s, Dr. Alexander Shulgin. Both of those, in their laboratories, doctors in their own right, experimented and somewhat put forth a use and abuse of synthetic drugs, but in a very different type of realm than we deal with today. The use and abuse and the literature that was out there was somewhat controlled. Next slide, please. As Dr. Bauman's already stated, we're in a very different world these days, with both youth all the way through people of into their 50s and 60s being able to jump online and obtain any information they want, sometimes not specific and good information, and not only that, can jump online and buy various drugs covertly behind their keyboard from a variety of source countries around the world. Next slide, please. What are we looking at? The designer drug phenomenon. Very simply, I have a bit of listed bullets here. Designer drug distribution as a whole is a niche, and the designer drugs are made and sold to circumvent existing drug laws. More times than not, a lot of the traffickers were one time, say, mainstream traffickers who now have gotten in the business of synthetic or designer drugs to circumvent those common illegal drugs on the street, yet always putting forward that illusion of legality. For the most part, you'll ask the end user and how these drugs hit the market and why they're so popular is they were first used to try to get around, undermine routine clinical drug testing, such as urinalysis for a job or maybe being on probation. Consumer very many times misperceive the drugs as maybe less powerful or definitely as legal. Next slide, please. One thing we're seeing on the enforcement side has already been mentioned. There's an unprecedented introduction of these drugs on the market. We see new drugs every week, and we're doing a good job keeping up, but we need help from all sides, and we identifying from the scientific community and throughout law enforcement with exchanges of intel. There are devastating consequences that have already been mentioned, and you'll hear more today. It's because these drugs, no one really knows yet what they do to the body, short-term, long-term. Manufacturers have and distributors have demonstrated a reckless disregard for the public safe, and usually for one reason. Next slide, please. That reason is to make money. And as you see here, these drugs, as I mentioned earlier, what makes these different than all designer drugs, synthetic drugs we've seen, is they actually found themselves into a brick-and-mortar retail setting due to the fact when they came to the U.S., they did not fit into legislation that we already had on the books. Next slide, please. Going very quickly over what has already been talked about today, the three most prevalent synthetic or designer drugs we're seeing on the street can fall into categories: synthetic cannabinoid products, synthetic stimulants, the cathinone products or bath salts, and the hallucinogens. Next slide, please. Synthetic cannabinoids, known as spice or K2, spice being the European term that was coined back in around 2004 when this product was created in Europe and then came over to the U.S. in roughly 2008, simply came to be due to the fact that the carrier medium, the organic material which the cannabinoid compound is mixed onto, looks like a spice. Some traffickers say it looks like oregano, hence the name spice. The traffickers will market these products always with labels that are catchy and labels that say not for human consumption. First used to circumvent those FDA regulations on the books when first coming to the United States, and now utilized to circumvent criminal law enforcement and prosecution. Next slide, please. The second type of designer drugs, and I'll go quickly because we've already talked about these, are synthetic cathinones. We see synthetic cathinones, the stimulants, bath salts, still on the street and still being trafficked, but not in retail settings like we once did. You may be able to find those still in a bit of a retail setting, but all of these drugs, including synthetic cathinones, are now slowly making their way out of that brick-and-mortar corner store retail and going somewhat conventional underground like most covert-type sold controlled substances. Even though the synthetic cannabinoids you may still see due to the fact the traffickers themselves perpetuate this illusion of legality, trying to make yet more money selling their wares. Next slide, please. The synthetic hallucinogens, and not that I can say one is more dangerous than the other, but these are the most unknown. The N-bombs, also known as smiles, sometimes used by the end user thinking they're one thing, or even trafficked by the trafficker believing they ordered 5, 10, 20 grams of LSD off of a covert internet website when in fact they received from a foreign land some unknown stimulant hallucinogen. They have no idea what it is, but then sell it at a venue as LSD. Not that LSD itself is not dangerous, but when the traffickers and the end users are using a drug where they have no idea what they're using, it adds another layer of danger. Next slide, please. Very rudimentary and very simple. What we're seeing, for the most part, the majority of all the chemical compounds that make synthetic drugs are coming in from overseas, predominantly the People's Republic of China. Money goes overseas. The compounds are sent via commercial carrier, many of which are caught at the borders of postal facilities, DHL, FedEx, UPS, every single day. But there are many that get through, thus the controlled substances are sold on the street. Next slide, please. Not breaking down manufacture altogether, but since we're focusing on synthetic cannabinoids, and just to give a very basic look at some photos, the synthetic cannabinoid compound in the upper left is brought into the U.S. in kilograms, sometimes less, sometimes more quantities. That compound is diluted, and then it is mixed, more times than not. A lot of people say spray on a herbal type setting, but it's usually mixed in a large manufacturing site, and hence then dried and sold as a smokable synthetic cannabinoid product known on the street as synthetic marijuana, spice, K2, and many other names. Next slide, please. As I've said before, this slide sums up the trafficker themselves, and if we all keep in mind and educate ourselves that the sometimes ridiculous argument by the trafficker that this stuff is legal due to the chemical not itself being banned is really just a tool in perpetuating this illusion of legality, which will keep things going and thus keep money in their pockets. Next slide, please. On the law enforcement side, there are a number of things that we're doing every day, and we are making headway in this problem, which caught us at around 2007, 2008, and we first saw no laws on the books to help us fight. The laws are catching up, and law enforcement is catching up every day and is somewhat ahead in some facets of designer drug enforcement. And just to break down a few of these areas, domestic intelligence, coordination between law enforcement both at the borders, the mail facilities, all the way down to the state and locals working smoke shops or convenience stores, sharing of intelligence and knowing what is out there. Educating law enforcement and the prosecution teams, prosecutors alike, on laws that have been on the books for many years but have not been used that often, such as the Controlled Substance Analog Enforcement Act, which allows law enforcement and prosecutors to get a drug maybe which isn't on the books as illegal itself to compare it against one of the actual listed drugs and thus prosecute the offender. Coordination with source countries such as China, which I showed on a slide a few slides ago, both directly and through the United Nations and their Office of Drug and Crime. Next, legislation and emergency scheduling. Legislation on the state level as well as on the federal level is doing a good job. There can always be more, but legislation is keeping up with the problem as we go, and DEA is exercising its emergency scheduling power to stay with or sometimes ahead and unfortunately sometimes a step behind the trafficker. Traditional enforcement, as I've mentioned on and off, interdiction of the drugs at the border, investigating the manufacturers, the sources, both domestically and foreign, and investigating the end distributor and educating that distributor if a convenience store owner is selling one of these products, maybe not knowing what it is, educating that individual and having them stop what they for one time believed was legal. And of course, what we're here doing today is educating the public and getting the word out and letting people know what these are and the dangers of the use. Next slide, please. This and many more things can be found at DEA.gov for more details, and DEA does a very good job posting on our public website the new and emerging drugs of abuse and the drugs which may cause a problem once they do hit the streets. I encourage all to visit DEA.gov and educate themselves. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Scott. Scott, on your slide on synthetic cathinones or bath salts, you mentioned the term hotspots. Could you just say a little bit about that?
Well, hotspots is a term, yes ma'am. Hotspots is a term that can be used not only with synthetic cathinones, and I could talk for many, many minutes on the issues surrounding the manufacturing of various designer synthetic drugs. Hotspots can be used with all of these synthetic designer drugs. We even see them more, such as in the synthetic cannabinoids. For instance, when the synthetic cannabinoid compound is mixed with the carrier medium, there is no industry standard on creating this designer drug. Therefore, one section of the drugs that are created, the smokable product, could have 17% of active compound, active cannabinoid in it. Another section of what is being created could have 0.5%. Therefore, that large 17% side would be considered a hotspot. Thus, the end user may, down the road, purchase a drug, which they may believe is legal, which is 10 to 17 times stronger than maybe the drug they utilized a week earlier.
Thank you very much. And now we'll hear from Keith and Debbie Bjork from North Dakota. They've been married for 32 years. Keith is in the financial services industry, and Debbie is a licensed real estate agent. Their son, Christian, died of a synthetic drug overdose in June 2012. The Bjorks were featured by CNN in a piece on deadly highs, which also focused on their work to promote awareness about the dangers of new synthetic drugs. So I'll turn it over to you, Keith and Debbie.
Thank you, Deputy Director, and thank you for allowing us to participate in this webinar. We wanted to share our story with Christian and explain to everyone listening out there why synthetic drugs are your problem too. Christian was our middle son. He was very close to both his brothers. He was only a year and a half older than our youngest son. And they were just a grade apart in high school. And at the time of Christian's death, he was just finishing up his senior year. And my husband and I had 2 kids in high school, and we did not know about synthetic drugs. we had heard about synthetic marijuana, and we had heard of a few cases of bath salts on the news, but we had no knowledge of the extent of synthetic drugs. Next slide, please.
At the time of Christian's death on June 11th, like my wife said, he was just finishing his senior year and getting ready to go off and play college football. Our recollections of the day that he died are painful, to say the least. He was a good kid, and this was totally unlike him. It just had never occurred to us that it was ever going to be a problem, especially with him, and especially in light of the fact that he was going off to play football, and they were certain to do urine testing and those kind of things, and it never occurred to us that it would ever put anything like that in jeopardy and take any sort of a drug.
Next slide, please. On the evening of June 10th, that day we had been at the lake. We had a nice day at the lake with the family. My husband and son came home and worked out in the basement. And it was probably around 10 o'clock in the evening. My son, Christian, gave my husband a hug and a kiss, and he said, "I love you, Dad. I'll be right back." He was going to go out and run a quick errand. And those were the last words that Christian spoke to us. He never came home that night. And we found out later that while he was out, he ran into a classmate of his who invited him to a house party. Now, this was a normal, typical home in a very normal, nice neighborhood. There was a parent home. Earlier in the day, the occupants of the house, the 20-year-old and the 18-year-old living there, had decided to have a party and had pooled their money together to buy what they called acid. And there were 7 kids in attendance at this house party, including a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old. All of the kids there ingested this acid. And when 3 of the boys started suffering the ill effects of the drug, they were kicked out of the house. Now, my son was kicked out without even his shoes on. He made it as far as the front sidewalk, where he collapsed and died. And a passerby the next morning saw his body lying there and called 911. There was a 15-year-old boy found next to my son who was incoherent, had to be taken to the hospital and put in a medically induced coma. His life was saved. He still has residual effects from this drug. Another 18-year-old was found a couple blocks away, wandering in a park completely naked. One of the things that these drugs do, this one in particular, is that they raise your core body temperature to unsustainable levels. And so the 18-year-old had stripped off his clothes. It probably helped save his life. Next slide, please. So while the cops were taking my son's body to have an autopsy done and interviewing the kids at the house, that same day, later on that same day, the same drug dealer who had provided the so-called acid to the kids at the house had some left over that he mixed with melted chocolate and provided it to 17-year-old Elijah Stye, who was in town visiting his cousin. And within 2.5 hours, Elijah stopped breathing. There was a homeowner home that night as well, and the kids in the house had witnessed him going into convulsions and foaming at the mouth, banging his head, and then going into a catatonic state. They told the parent home not to call 911 because they were telling the parent that this was just a bad mushroom trip. And in that case, they were calling it extractive mushroom, which again goes back to what we heard earlier, that these drugs are not portrayed as what they really are. 911 was called. They were able to resuscitate Elijah. He was put on life support, but he was brain dead. And the day of our son's funeral, Elijah's family had to have him disconnected from life support. Next slide, please.
There were so many other things going on in our lives, in terms of the funeral and trying to get over this and adjust to this new station in life that we had. And the only news we were getting about any of this stuff was from the local newspaper, and we were, whenever we questioned the police about this, they were circumspect, and they only told us that they were still looking into everything. They didn't know exactly what had happened. About 3 weeks after Christian died, we were asked to go downtown to visit with the police, and that's when we met with the detectives from Grand Forks, as well as the Chris Meyer, who is the United States Attorney for the state of North Dakota. And they said they were going to take this and make it a federal issue because, well, as you can see from the slide, they were all part of a task force, and they put this thing into perspective for us. They still couldn't tell us much of what went on, and I remember leaving that meeting still unaware that all these other things were going to happen, but I left with an urgency to get this news out to the world that there was a deadly drug out there, and these predators were selling it to our kids on the premise that it was something fairly mundane. So we didn't want to let Christian be a footnote. We wanted to give a voice to our son.
So the federal authorities quickly tracked this drug all the way to its source in Houston, Texas. And it was being sold by an online company called Motion Resources. They were doing business in all 50 states. They had over 2,000 clients. Within 60 days, 15 people were arrested, and this nationwide drug conspiracy was put to a stop. We did attend the sentencing hearings for the people directly involved with the death of Christian and Elijah, and we read victim impact statements at those hearings. Next slide, please. The drug that killed my son and Elijah was not acid or extractive mushroom. It was 2,5-I-NBOMA, which is a very powerful, dangerous synthetic drug. You can see from the slide the other names that it is called by, and the fact that it is imported from overseas and can be mixed up in powder, or the powder can be mixed up with melted chocolate or put on blotter paper. One of the things I'd like to say as a parent is that I hate the name designer drug, because anytime you use the name designer, you think of something that everybody wants, like a designer handbag or designer clothing. And these drugs are not desirable in any way, shape, or form. They are poison. They are industrial-grade chemicals that are pumped out of criminal laboratories, and they've never been tested on humans. My son, Christian, in 2009 was in the 9th grade. And in 2012, he was finishing up his senior year. So his classmate of high schoolers from 2009 to 2012 were truly the first group of kids that were exposed on a nationwide level to synthetic drugs that were being sold legally in the corner tobacco store. Next slide, please.
When we wanted to let you know too that when we talked to the forensics expert who from the FBI who had the results of Christian's autopsy, she noted that it only took a dose about the size of 2 or 3 grains of salt enough to cover the tip of a ballpoint pen was the term she used, to kill my son, a 6'5", 250-pound athlete. When we heard that there was going to be a pharmacy board hearing, I called Bismarck. I called our legislators, and actually I spoke to Wayne Stenjum, the Attorney General, and asked if we could go, and told them who we were and what had happened. And so we spoke to the pharmacy board, and they enacted an emergency law on November 30th of 2012. And after the meeting, we spoke with Lois Delmore, who's our state legislature and who is Christian's English teacher. And they were in the process of preparing a bill, House Bill 1133. And so we spoke to the legislature and we spoke to the Senate as well 3 different times. And the bill was passed, and it covers, it's essentially the same as the federal law in North Dakota now, and it covers even the drugs that are unknown as of now. Debbie?
The next slide in front of you talks about the 36th meeting that the World Health Organization had, their expert committee on drug dependence, which was held in June of 2014, 2 years after my son's death. And as a mom out there researching stuff on the internet, I was amazed to find this report, and even further amazed to know that my son and Elijah are both mentioned in this report. But the main thing that I want people out there to know is the World Health Organization found in their report that this drug, 2,5-NBOMe, is reportedly sold as LSD or as a legal alternative, as a research chemical, that they are clandestinely manufactured, and they are serious risks to public health. They have no recognized therapeutic use and no medical use. Next slide, please. Also contained in this same report is a list of the U.S. fatalities they knew of up until June of 2014. And you can see on this slide that the average age of these individuals taking these drugs is 20 years old. The age range is between 15 and 29 years on average. These drugs cause unpredictable violent behavior and death. And you can see in this report that in June 2012, 2 teenagers fatally overdosed on 2,5-NBOMe. Next slide, please. As a result of our journey, as my husband mentioned, we did testify at the North Dakota State Pharmacy Board. We also testified at 2 state Senate legislative hearings when they were in the process of holding hearings to change our state law. At the time of my son's death, unbelievably, this drug was actually legal in the state of North Dakota. And at the last hearing I went to, I said, this is the last hearing my husband and I will be at. If you guys don't change our law next year, there will be another parent up here speaking because they will have lost a child. The other law that I called for was an immunity law. It's also called a Good Samaritan law in other states. But it grants immunity to a person who stays with someone that is overdosing and calls for help for that person. In my son's case, we found out later that no one wanted to call for help because they were afraid of getting into trouble themselves. Next slide, please.
You know that one thing we found out going to all the hearings, especially the sentencing hearings, is that there's an enormous amount of apathy in society regarding just drugs in general. Society has a tendency to blame the user in these cases. And Federal Judge Ralph Erickson said it best at one of the hearings. And he said it probably at 3 or 4. And this is a quote: "Drug dealers are merchants of death. Some die right away like Christian and Elijah. Some die slowly because their lives are robbed day by day from drug use. And it seemed to put, an exclamation point on the on what he was saying that day. There should be a strong message in this to every parent, and we had to learn this the hard way because we were part of that blithely ignorant group. Parents have to supervise what's going on in their own home. The search warrants that were conducted on the homes where the Christian Elijah died found all kinds of drugs and drug paraphernalia. In fact, in one case, 3 or 4 pages worth. Parents were home at both homes in both these cases, and when those kids died. So, as a parent, pay attention to everything that's going on. None of the kids called. They were worried about themselves. And the thing we all need to do is we all need to stand up and advocate to ensure your state law makes selling and possession of all these illegal drugs, these synthetics in particular, illegal. Just get them off the streets because they're going to keep on killing kids until, all of us adults stand up and do something about it. Next slide, please.
CNN did do a documentary on what happened to Christian and Elijah, and that documentary is now posted on YouTube. I would encourage everyone to go to the link that you see here and watch the documentary. What CNN reporters did was actually order some of these drugs online. They took them to a forensic laboratory, had them analyzed and tested, and they even had an undercover reporter in one of the factories in China where they were, manufacturing these drugs. And you can hear the dealer in the factory sitting there laughing and making a joke about how, they're packaged with, quote, not for human consumption. And then he laughs about it and says, but we know what they're really being used for. So thank you all for letting us share our story of Christian with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. and Mrs. Burke. We're going to take a couple of questions now, so we'll open the line.
All right, let's go over first the line of Neil Elam.
Thank you for taking my call. I have a question for the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It was really informative. I was just curious, is there a way to tell if a person is using these drugs? What symptoms could we be able to identify? And then the final part, what can we do if we think someone is using them? Thank you.
Okay, so with regard to symptoms, the symptoms from these designer drugs or new synthetic drugs, as I mentioned, at lower doses you can see effects that are consistent with the drugs they intend to mimic. However, at higher doses, if they're exhibiting aberrant behavior, psychotic symptoms, hyperthermia, I just would recommend that you would immediately get someone to the hospital, to the emergency department. That's the only kind of advice I could give you. And the second part of your question was what you should do if you think that your son or daughter or husband or wife is taking these substances. I would get them immediately to professionals because addiction to these synthetic drugs can be as bad or worse than drugs like cocaine or heroin or other drugs, and really the only way to manage this type of problem is with the appropriate medical help. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
All right, let's go over now to the line of Kristen Hayford.
So this question is for Debbie and Keith. When you were working to get laws passed in North Dakota, who were the community groups that you worked with?
We really didn't step up to the community groups. I didn't know where to go. I'm still looking for help to get this word out there. We went directly to the people that could change the laws, and we jumped up and down. I don't know what else to tell you. I think, North Dakota, fortunately, is a small state, and we can get a hold of a legislator. I know there are groups here, but here's the funny thing, is that there's very little information being put out there in our state right now regarding this problem. I would love to see more interaction with some of the community groups and have some of them step up. I wish there was a way for us to make that happen. People need to know. I can't tell you how devastating this whole thing was to our family, let alone my son's friends, and the community in general. I think was just taken back. Nobody expects this to happen here. So I think we need to know. Debbie, did you?
Well, I was just going to say that there have been a couple of the groups in town who brought speakers in from out of town. Those, we don't really have an ongoing forum or a community group here that is really getting the information out to people. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, we would love to do that.
This is Mary Lou Leary again. We sponsor coalitions across the country. They're grassroots coalitions that work on prevention issues, and they're called the Drug-Free Community Support Coalition. So if anybody wants to contact ONDCP, we can give you information about that. We have time for one more question.
All right, that sounds good. Let's go over to the line of Cindy Boyd.
Hi, this question is for the DEA. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about where we are with prosecutions related to the new synthetic drugs. And the second part of the question is, how does DEA work with local law enforcement on these cases?
Okay, sure. As far as the prosecution, that's a very good question. With these, as I mentioned earlier, the traffickers, unfortunately, since these new synthetic drugs, these new designer drugs have hit the shores of the U.S., the traffickers are very well educated and have been successful on staying a step or maybe a half a step ahead of law enforcement prosecution on many occasions. Every day, another successful prosecution comes down the pipe, utilizing not only legislation that state and federal law has put in place, but utilizing things such as the analog law, which itself has many facets to it. And more people on the prosecution side and investigation side are starting to get in tune with laws of such. Law enforcement, drug law enforcement for years as a whole, it's been pretty simple to figure out a drug is illegal, you arrest the person, you prosecute the person. With these new synthetics adds a whole entire new realm to things where the drug itself, by name, will not be illegal, will not be found in the statute books. But after coordinating with prosecution and the scientific side of things, the chemists, the pharmacologists, and working as a team, those drugs are then made to fit under various analog laws. So every day those analog laws are used more and more, and legislation at the state and federal level are keeping up with, and prosecutions have been much more successful in the last 2 to 3 to 4 years than at first when these drugs were first seen. The second part of your question is how, on the federal level, how are we working with state and local law enforcement? We at the federal level simply could not do our job if we didn't work with state and local law enforcement, especially if they're the first responders. They're the first ones that see the drugs, for instance, being sold in a pseudo-legitimate retail setting. Or even they're the ones maybe working those cases where the user amounts are being sold and purchased on the streets. So that part of the drug fight when it comes to synthetics is really not much different other than when we combat the trafficking of cocaine or marijuana. The ongoing cooperation continues. The one thing we are doing much more is from the federal level and things such as this, but catered more towards law enforcement, the education side of the house. We provide a lot of education, a lot of training to the state and local counterparts to educate them as to the new things we're seeing on the street, the new threats that are coming in from China or elsewhere. Hopefully I've helped you, I've answered your question.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up now, but I want to thank all the speakers for their presentations. Today our goal was to increase awareness of the dangers of new synthetic drugs and to provide information to help prevent their use and reduce access to them. This webinar was recorded and it will be posted shortly on YouTube. You can also find the presentations on the ONDCP website as well as resources with more information about these drugs, and we hope that you'll find that helpful. I also hope that you'll join us this spring when we will hold the second webinar in our series. That will highlight community responses to prevent use and distribution of new synthetic drugs. In the summer, we're planning a third webinar to focus on international cooperation to reduce the manufacture of new synthetic drugs and international control and scheduling efforts. As recently as March 2015, and for the first time in over a decade, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, in its role as a treaty body for the 3 United Nations Drug Control Conventions, reviewed a number of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances for control, and they took decisions to control the majority of those. Member states had pushed to revive this authority to help address the new synthetic drugs, and the Commission took action on 10 new synthetic drugs, including 25B M-bomb-E, 25C M-bomb-E, and 251 M-bomb-E, the drug that killed Christians. In 2013, using our emergency scheduling authority, the United States controlled these substances temporarily for 2 years. International scheduling is the first step for many countries to control these substances domestically, and it's a significant step forward in reducing their availability. We're going to learn more about these efforts and other international collaborations in the third webinar. The Office of National Drug Control Policy will send out information about these webinars shortly. Thank you so much for joining us today. Goodbye, and hope that we will hear from you on our next webinar.